The waiter insulted Tyler Perry at a luxury restaurant, not knowing he owned it. Tyler Perry stepped into the Monarch, one of the most prestigious restaurants in Atlanta, Georgia, where the city's elite gathered to indulge in fine dining. The restaurant was renowned for its grand chandeliers, velvet-lined seating, and an atmosphere that exuded luxury. It was the kind of place where appearances mattered, where wealth and social standing dictated the level of service one received. On any given night, politicians, business magnates, and celebrities graced its dining room, effortlessly blending into the opulence. But tonight, an unexpected guest walked through its doors, one who would soon expose an ugly truth about the establishment. Dressed in a simple black t-shirt, faded jeans, and a worn leather jacket, Tyler's entrance was unassuming. Unlike other Hollywood figures who basked in fame and extravagance, he had always maintained a grounded presence, a reflection of his humble beginnings. He wasn't one to flaunt his success or demand attention. All he wanted tonight was a quiet meal, away from the noise of his busy life. Yet, despite his efforts to go unnoticed, he caught the attention of Lauren, one of the restaurant's senior waitresses. Lauren prided herself on her ability to assess customers at a glance. She had spent years working at the Monarch and believed that her experience gave her the right to determine who belonged there and who didn't. She saw herself not just as a waitress but as a gatekeeper of the restaurant's exclusivity. When she spotted Tyler standing at the entrance, casually dressed and devoid of any ostentatious wealth, her initial reaction was one of barely concealed disdain. She sauntered toward him, her carefully practiced smile just a thin veil over the judgment lurking beneath. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice smooth but lacking warmth. "Do you have a reservation?" The slight arch of her eyebrow made it clear she doubted he did. Tyler met her gaze with his usual calm demeanor. "No, but I was hoping to get a table," he replied, his voice polite yet firm. Lauren let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head slightly as if amused by his request. "Sir, this is the Monarch, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Atlanta." She paused, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if she were doing him a favor by being candid. "Are you sure you can afford to dine here?" Her words, laced with condescension, hung in the air, and for the first time, other diners turned their heads. Whispers rippled through the elegant dining hall as a few patrons discreetly glanced in Tyler's direction. Some looked on with curiosity, others with a mix of amusement and discomfort. Tyler, however, remained completely unfazed. He had spent his entire life defying expectations, and moments like these no longer surprised him. He simply nodded and said, "Yes, I'm sure." Lauren hesitated, clearly expecting a different reaction. Most people, when subtly humiliated, would either shrink away or react defensively. But Tyler's calm confidence only seemed to frustrate her. With an exaggerated sigh, she grabbed a menu and motioned for him to follow. Instead of leading him to the well-lit, beautifully arranged center of the dining room, she took him toward the back, where the atmosphere was starkly different. The table she chose was tucked near the kitchen, where the muffled clatter of pots and pans could be heard over the hum of conversation. The lighting was dimmer, the ambiance far less refined. It was the sort of table given to guests who, in her judgment, didn't deserve to be part of the Monarch's elite experience. She placed the menu on the table with a careless thud. "Here you go," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This should be comfortable for you." Tyler took his seat, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone so neutral it was impossible to tell whether he had picked up on her sarcasm or if he simply didn't care. Lauren crossed her arms, tapping her nails against her elbow as she studied him. "If you need anything, just let me know. But only if it's necessary, okay?" she added with a smirk before turning on her heel and walking away. As she disappeared into the dining area, she muttered just loud enough for a nearby couple to hear, "He won't last 5 minutes here." Tyler picked up the menu and began scanning it with a steady gaze. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't rattled. He had been through far worse in his life than a dismissive waitress with an overinflated sense of authority. He had no intention of letting this small encounter ruin his evening. Across the room, an older gentleman named Mr. Carter had been observing the interaction. A retired judge with an eye for injustice, he had seen more than his fair share of prejudice in his lifetime. He nudged his wife and murmured, That young man has more patience than most. Let's see how this plays out. Meanwhile, Lauren, still under the impression that she had put Tyler in his place, returned to the front of the restaurant. She leaned against the hostess stand, laughing quietly with another server. "You should have seen his face when I took him to the back. He thinks he belongs here. I give it 5 minutes before he asks for the check." Her coworker shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Not everyone at the Monarch shared Lauren's elitist views, but few dared to challenge her outright. After all, she had been at the restaurant long enough to feel untouchable. Back at his table, Tyler took in his surroundings, calmly watching the servers move through the restaurant. Despite the less-than-ideal seating arrangement, he found himself enjoying the jazz music softly playing in the background. He knew that Lauren had expected a reaction from him: frustration, embarrassment, maybe even anger. But he wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, waiting patiently for her to return. Lauren took her time before returning to Tyler's table. She had made a habit of prioritizing the guests she deemed more worthy of the restaurant's exceptional service. As she flitted between tables, laughing at a joke from a sharply dressed businessman and engaging in animated conversation with an elegantly dressed woman sipping a glass of fine wine, she deliberately ignored the presence of the man she had seated near the kitchen. She wanted him to feel out of place, to squirm under the weight of his own discomfort. But Tyler Perry was anything but uncomfortable. He sat there with an air of quiet confidence, casually observing the restaurant's atmosphere. The polished marble floors, the golden glow of the chandeliers, the faint clinking of silverware against fine china. It was all as luxurious as he had imagined, yet none of it impressed him as much as the way people carried themselves within its walls. The rich and privileged dined here not just for the food, but for the validation that came with it. They sought an experience that reaffirmed their place above the rest. It was the kind of mindset that had fueled Lauren's attitude. After what felt like an intentional delay, Lauren finally returned, notepad in hand, her practiced smile as thin as ever. "Have you decided what you'd like to order?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, already anticipating what she assumed would be a hesitant response. Tyler, still as composed as ever, glanced down at the menu and then back at her. "Yes, I'll have the filet de Rossini," he said with certainty. Lauren barely contained her amusement. That particular dish, one of the restaurant's signature entrees, was a meticulously prepared cut of filet mignon, topped with seared foie gras and black truffle sauce, priced at a hefty $350. She pursed her lips as if holding back laughter. "Sir, just so you're aware, that dish is quite expensive. Are you sure about your choice?" Tyler met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "Yes, I'm sure." Lauren feigned a sympathetic nod before scribbling down the order with exaggerated flair. "All right then," she said, her voice dripping with false courtesy. "I just wanted to make sure there weren't any surprises when the bill arrives." She turned sharply on her heel and walked away, rolling her eyes as she made her way to the kitchen. At a nearby table, Mr. Carter, the retired judge who had been watching from the beginning, let out a deep sigh, shaking his head at his wife. "I don't like where this is going," he murmured. "That young man hasn't done anything wrong, but she's determined to make him feel small." Tyler, however, remained unbothered. He had endured far worse in his lifetime than the subtle humiliation of a prejudiced waitress. He had fought his way up from nothing, carving out a career against the odds, building an empire that spanned television, film, and theater. He had no intention of letting the shallow judgment of one individual disrupt his evening. Lauren, meanwhile, saw his patience as a challenge. As the kitchen staff promptly prepared his order, she deliberately took her time before picking up the plate. She stopped to chat with another waiter, laughed at another patron's joke, and made a point of adjusting a nearby table's silverware as if she had all the time in the world. Only then, after she had sufficiently delayed, did she retrieve Tyler's meal, carrying it to his table with a feigned look of politeness. With an unnecessarily forceful motion, she placed the dish before him. "Here's your meal," she said with an artificial sweetness that barely masked her condescension. "I hope it's to your liking." Tyler nodded in gratitude. "Thank you." Lauren hesitated, expecting something, perhaps an awkward shift in his demeanor, a flicker of unease. When she received none of it, she decided to push further. "Oh, and just so you know," she added, lowering her voice just enough for the nearby tables to hear, "we expect a minimum tip of 20% here, just in case you weren't aware." Tyler simply smiled. "I appreciate the reminder." Frustrated by his lack of reaction, Lauren turned away sharply, making her way back toward the front of the restaurant. As Tyler cut into his meal, savoring each bite without a hint of discomfort, the whispers in the dining room grew. People had noticed the exchange. Some were amused, others disapproving. The elderly Mr. Carter sighed again, unable to hide his disappointment. "This has gone too far," he said, dabbing his mouth with his napkin before finally deciding he had seen enough. He pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. He made his way toward Tyler's table, his polished navy blue suit exuding quiet authority. As he approached, Tyler looked up, meeting his gaze with a hint of curiosity. "Good evening, young man," Mr. Carter said with a warm smile. "I couldn't help but notice the way you've been treated tonight. I just wanted to commend you for your patience. Not many would have handled it with such grace." Tyler, always appreciative of kindness, returned the smile. "Thank you, sir. I believe in giving people a chance." Before Mr. Carter could reply, another figure entered the scene. The restaurant's general manager, Jonathan Williams, had just arrived on the floor after being alerted by the kitchen staff that something was amiss. As his eyes scanned the dining room, he froze when he spotted Tyler Perry seated in the dimly lit corner. A look of recognition and horror flashed across his face. Jonathan immediately hurried toward the table, his voice carrying across the room. "Mr. Perry!" he exclaimed, his tone shifting from professional detachment to unmistakable deference. "I had no idea you'd be dining with us tonight. It's an absolute honor to have you here." The entire restaurant fell silent. Lauren, who had just returned to the front of the dining room, suddenly stopped in her tracks. The color drained from her face as she turned to see Jonathan standing beside the man she had belittled all evening. Her eyes widened in horror as the realization sank in. The man she had seated near the kitchen, the man she had mocked, doubted, and attempted to humiliate, was none other than one of the owners of the Monarch. Jonathan, still oblivious to what had transpired, continued, "Sir, if I had known you were coming, I would have ensured you received the finest service. Please allow me to personally attend to anything you need." The weight of the moment settled heavily on Lauren. The dining room, once filled with idle chatter, now hung in stunned silence. Guests who had witnessed her behavior turned their attention toward her, watching with curiosity to see what would happen next. Tyler, still perfectly composed, turned to face Lauren, who stood frozen in place, her once confident posture now trembling under the weight of her mistake. He studied her for a moment before finally speaking, his voice calm yet firm. "Let's talk about how we treat people." Lauren's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The smugness that had once lined her features was gone, replaced by an expression of sheer disbelief and growing shame. Mr. Carter, still standing nearby, folded his arms across his chest, nodding approvingly. Jonathan, suddenly realizing that something deeper had occurred before his arrival, turned to Lauren with a sharp glare. "Lauren, what exactly happened here?" she stammered, glancing desperately around the room for an escape. I didn't know, sir. I just—" Jonathan's expression hardened. Didn't know what? That he was the owner? That he was someone worthy of respect? His voice, though even, carried the unmistakable weight of authority. The dining room remained hushed, the tension thick in the air. Lauren swallowed hard, understanding fully that there was no talking her way out of this one. The very thing she had feared most, the exposure of her bias, the collapse of her fabricated superiority, had unfolded before her, and there was no escaping it. And Tyler Perry, still seated, still poised, waited for her response. Lauren stood frozen, her mind racing for a way to salvage the situation, but there was no way out. The reality of what she had done hit her like a wave. She had spent the entire evening belittling a man who not only had the financial means to be there, but also had the power to decide whether she would continue working at the Monarch. The weight of the stares pressing down on her from other diners, from her fellow staff members, from the elderly man who had spoken up, it all made her want to disappear. Jonathan Williams, the restaurant's general manager, exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he looked between Tyler Perry and the now visibly shaken Lauren. He had spent years maintaining the Monarch's reputation, ensuring it remained a place of sophistication and respect. And now, in one night, his staff had managed to tarnish that reputation right in front of one of the most influential figures in the entertainment industry. "Lauren," Jonathan said, his voice steady but unmistakably authoritative, "you owe Mr. Perry an explanation." Lauren swallowed hard. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She couldn't think of anything to say that would excuse what had happened. Finally, after a painfully long silence, she managed to stammer, I didn't realize who he was." Tyler studied her, his face betraying no emotion. His response was calm, measured. And that's the problem. The entire restaurant remained silent, hanging on to his every word. Tyler leaned forward slightly, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge of the table. It shouldn't take knowing who someone is for them to be treated with dignity. What if I had been just another man walking in here after a long day? What if I wasn't famous or successful? Would that make me any less deserving of kindness and respect? Lauren's eyes darted to Jonathan, silently pleading for help. But he didn't move. He let her sit in her discomfort because he knew Tyler was right. The restaurant had always prided itself on its exclusivity. But exclusivity should never be confused with entitlement, and tonight had exposed that distinction with painful clarity. Tyler sighed, his gaze softening ever so slightly. He had no desire to humiliate Lauren further. He had made his point, but he wanted to leave something more than just shame behind. "I grew up with nothing," he said, his voice quieter now but still strong enough to be heard. "I've been turned away from places because of how I looked. I've had doors shut in my face. But I built my way up, not just with talent, but with kindness. And I never forgot what it felt like to be judged before I even said a word." He gestured around the room. "There are people in here tonight who saw what happened, who sat in silence. Some of them agreed with you. Some of them were too uncomfortable to speak up. But everyone here should ask themselves one thing. When did we start deciding a person's worth by the clothes on their back?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A few of the wealthier patrons looked away, realizing they had been complicit in the culture that allowed this to happen. Even the staff, some of whom had smirked earlier at Lauren's antics, now seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment. Jonathan cleared his throat and turned to Tyler. "Mr. Perry, I can't express how deeply I regret what happened tonight. I assure you, this is not the standard we uphold at the Monarch." Tyler nodded. "I believe you, but words aren't enough. This isn't just about me. This is about the next person who walks in here looking like they don't belong. What happens to them?" Jonathan's jaw tightened and he nodded slowly, understanding that the issue was bigger than one bad encounter. "We will do better," he said firmly. "I will personally see to it that changes are made." Lauren, who had been standing in stunned silence, finally found her voice. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice small. "I was wrong." Tyler studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "That's a start." Jonathan exhaled, rubbing his temple before speaking again. "Lauren, I need you to take the rest of the night off. We'll have a conversation about this later." Lauren, knowing there was no point in arguing, simply nodded and turned, walking quickly toward the back of the restaurant, her face pale. Tyler watched her go, then stood up, glancing around the room one last time. The energy had shifted. The room, once filled with idle chatter and casual elitism, now buzzed with quiet reflection. Some diners avoided his gaze, while others nodded in respect. Mr. Carter, still standing nearby, gave a slow, approving nod. "Well said, young man," he murmured. "This city could use more people like you." Tyler smiled slightly and shook his hand. "I appreciate that, sir." Jonathan took a step forward. "Mr. Perry, please, allow us to offer you a meal on the house as an apology." Tyler held up a hand, shaking his head. "No need. I came here for a meal, and I got one. But I'll tell you this, I'll be back. And when I do, I hope I see a different restaurant, not in decor or in status, but in the way it treats its guests." Jonathan nodded solemnly. "Understood." Tyler glanced toward the door, then took a deep breath and strode toward the exit. As he reached for the handle, he paused for just a moment, looking up at the gold-plated "The Monarch" sign that hung above the entrance. He knew that places like this wouldn't change overnight, but at least tonight, a small crack had formed in the carefully curated illusion of exclusivity. Maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to let the light in. He pushed open the door and stepped into the cool Atlanta night, his breath steady, his steps unwavering. The city lights flickered around him, casting a glow over the streets. He had come for dinner, but he had left behind something more valuable. A lesson that, if truly heard, had the power to change not just a restaurant but a culture. And as he walked away, a thought settled into his mind. One he had carried with him for years. In a world where you can be anything, choose to be kind.